welcome to another deep dive. Today we are looking at a legal, I guess showdown is the best way to put it, and it's all about intellectual property in the world of comics.
Yeah, it's really a question of, can a company, protect its brand while still allowing other artists the freedom to be creative?
Yeah, that's a great point.
Yeah.
So the jumping off point for this deep dive is a blog post called Space Morons, which is found on a website called Vox Populi.
Mm-hmm.
And the author Vox Day really gets into this case with Games Workshop, which, if you're a nerd at all, Games Workshop, they're the folks behind the really popular Warhammer tabletop game. And he's looking at this conflict they're having with a comic creator named Jon Del Arroz.
Yeah, and, Games Workshop has a bit of a history of, being very aggressive in defending its trademarks. They've gone after a bunch of different creators and companies over the years, so it's not a surprise that this is getting so much attention.
So what's the deal here? Games Workshop is trying to stop the publication of Del Arroz's comic, The Emerald Array. They're saying it infringes on their trademark for Space Marine. And when I hear Space Marine, that sounds generic, like, I don't know, like trying to trademark the word superhero or something. It's like, can they really own that?
Well, and that's exactly what Vox Day is arguing. He's saying that Games Workshop's claim is shaky because Space Marine has been a term used in science fiction like forever, way before Games Workshop came along.
So how can they even try to trademark something? So, I don't know, basic.
Well, trademark law is tricky. It's not always about how original a term is, but more about how it's used in a particular market. So, Games Workshop could make the argument that they've built up such a strong brand around Space Marine in, tabletop gaming and the miniature wargaming communities, that it's basically become synonymous with their product.
So, like, for people who are really into miniature wargaming, they hear Space Marine, and they immediately think Warhammer 40,000.
Yeah, that's exactly it. So it's what's called establishing a secondary meaning for the term within that niche market.
Mm-hmm.
And that can often be enough to get a trademark.
That's pretty clever.
Yeah.
But it also makes you wonder, like, is that fair to smaller creators who might also want to use Space Marine in their work? Is this, big corporation squashing creativity to protect their brand?
That's the big question, and it's one that Vox Day gets into. He thinks it's totally unfair, and he brings up this really interesting comparison to a case with the estate of Arthur Conan Doyle and Sherlock Holmes.
Oh, I love Sherlock Holmes. What happened there?
So the Conan Doyle estate was super protective of Sherlock Holmes for years. They claimed copyright over the whole character and everything about him. They even sued a publisher who was putting out an anthology of new Sherlock Holmes stories by different authors.
Really?
Yeah, it was a bold move. And in the end, it kind of backfired. The court ruled that while the estate owned the copyright to the newer Sherlock Holmes stories, anything from those early published works was public domain. So anybody could use those elements freely.
So they tried to control it too much and ended up losing their grip.
Exactly. And that's what Vox Day is suggesting could happen with Games Workshop and Space Marine. If they keep going after everybody who uses the term, they might end up facing a legal challenge that forces them to narrow their trademark. And ironically, that could weaken their hold on it.
So it's like a slippery slope. So what happened with Del Arroz's comic? Did Games Workshop shut it down?
Actually, no. And this is where things get really interesting.
I knew there had to be a twist.
So the crowdfunding platform hosting the comic Fund My Comic, they refused to take it down. They basically told Games Workshop to get lost.
No way. Good for them, standing up to the big guys.
Yeah, their founder, Luke Stone, he said their initial assessment showed that while the comic might have some derivative works, it didn't look like it was actually infringing on any of Games Workshop's trademarks. They don't seem to buy the argument that Space Marine is a super protected term.
That's amazing. You've got this little crowdfunding platform standing with the independent creator against a giant corporation. And it's really interesting they're focusing on the concept itself and not just the word.
It really shows how messy intellectual property law can be. So let's talk a little more about Del Arroz's comic.
Yeah, what is the Emerald Array all about anyway?
Well, according to Vox Day, it's about this group of space warriors. They're called Emerald Knights, and they're fighting against some kind of tyrannical empire.
Well, that sounds pretty cool. So they're not actually called Space Marines.
Right. Del Arroz seems to have avoided using that specific term, maybe to avoid any legal trouble. But it's pretty clear that the basic idea is the same. I mean, you've got these elite warriors, they're wearing power armor, they're fighting in space. It's hard to say it's not at least inspired by Games Workshop's Space Marines.
So legally, it's kind of a gray area. But Fund My Comic seems to be saying that Del Arroz is being creative enough that it's not infringement.
Yeah, and that's where that Sherlock Holmes case we talked about could be really important. If Games Workshop sued Del Arroz and lost, it could set a precedent that makes it harder for them to control the use of Space Marine in other situations. It might even mean that other creators could use the term more freely, as long as their characters and stories are different enough from the Warhammer stuff.
So this case could have a big impact on the whole sci-fi genre.
Oh, absolutely. And this is another point that Vox Day brings up. He emphasizes that Fund My Comic is refusing to remove the project. They're standing up to Games Workshop, basically saying, we don't think this is infringement.
That's pretty brave. I mean, Games Workshop is a huge company.
It is, and it really shows that Fund My Comic is committed to supporting independent creators. Luke Stone, their founder, has even said publicly that their legal team doesn't think the Emerald Array violates Games Workshop's trademarks. They see it as its own unique creative work.
Wow. It's like a classic David and Goliath story.
Yeah, it really is. And it'll be interesting to see what happens legally. If Games Workshop decides to sue Del Arroz, it could have a huge impact on intellectual property law in the comic book world.
So we've got this controversial trademark claim, this crowdfunding platform that's not backing down, and a potential legal battle that could change everything. This is getting pretty intense, but before we go too far down that road, let's take a closer look at Del Arroz's comic, The Emerald Array. What do we actually know about it?
Well, Vox Day says it's about this group of Space Marines, or I guess we should say Emerald Knights, as they're called in the comic, who are fighting against this evil empire.
Sounds epic. So they're not actually called Space Marines.
Right. Del Arroz seems to have done that on purpose, maybe to avoid any legal problems, but the idea is definitely similar. You've got elite warriors in power armor fighting in space. It's hard to say there's no connection to Games Workshop's Space Marines.
So it's kind of a legal gray area, but Fund My Comic seems to think Del Arroz is being original enough that it's not infringement.
Yeah, and this goes back to that Sherlock Holmes thing. If Games Workshop sued Del Arroz and lost it, could make it harder for them to control the use of Space Marine in general. It might even allow other creators to use the term, as long as they're not directly copying Games Workshop's characters or stories.
So this case could affect the whole sci-fi genre.
It really could.
Yeah.
It raises some big questions about intellectual property law. On the one hand, you want to protect creators' rights to their work, but you also don't want to stifle creativity by letting companies trademark really broad concepts.
It's a tough balance. But I have to say, I'm rooting for the little guy here. I mean, the Games Workshop is this huge corporation, and Del Arroz is just an independent creator trying to tell his story.
I get that. And it's important to note that Vox Day is definitely on Del Arroz's side in all this. He even encourages his readers to support Del Arroz's comic and mentions that it's going to be published by Arkhaven Comics, which is his own publishing company.
So there's a personal connection there.
Yeah. Vox Day is known for being critical of what he sees as corporations having too much power in creative industries. He thinks companies like Games Workshop are stifling creativity by being too quick to sue. So this case is kind of a rallying cry for him and his followers.
This is what I love about these deep dives. We start with what seems like a simple question. Can you trademark Space Marine? And we end up uncovering all this legal stuff and business stuff and ideological battles.
Yeah, it's a perfect example of how something that seems niche can actually have a big impact.
So let's bring it back to our listeners for a minute. What does all this mean for someone who's not a comic book creator or a lawyer? Why should they care about this case?
Well, I think the big takeaway is that intellectual property law is always changing. What might be considered infringement today might not be tomorrow. And the line between protecting a company's brand and stopping someone from being creative is not always clear. Ultimately, these decisions affect what kind of creative work we get to see in the future.
So we should all be paying attention to cases like this, even if we don't think they affect us directly.
Exactly. These cases shape the rules for everyone. They determine what stories can be told, what products can be made, and what kind of freedom we have as creators and consumers.
That's a pretty big deal.
It is.
But it also makes this whole deep dive even more interesting. We're not just talking about comics and trademarks.
No.
We're talking about the future of creativity.
I couldn't agree more. And that brings us to this big question that Vox Day asks at the end of his blog post.
Ooh, a cliffhanger. I'm on the edge of my seat.
He asks, if a term like Space Marine can be tightly controlled, what does that mean for the future of storytelling?
Wow, that's a really deep question. What do you think about that?
Well, I think it's something we need to consider carefully. You know, could this kind of trademark enforcement actually end up hurting creativity? It's a legitimate concern.
So you're saying Games Workshop might not have as strong a case as they think. This Space Marine trademark might not be so solid.
Yeah, it's definitely not a sure thing for them. Remember that Sherlock Holmes case we talked about? The court basically said some parts of the character were just so well known, they belong to everybody, not just the Conan Doyle estate. It's possible Space Marine could be seen the same way.
So even though Games Workshop made Space Marines popular with their Warhammer games, they can't just completely stop anyone else from using the term.
That's the big question. It depends on how the court interprets Space Marine in relation to Games Workshop's specific brand. They could probably protect the exact look of their Space Marines, or specific names and stories connected to them. But preventing anyone from using the general concept, that's a lot harder.
Voxday seems to think Games Workshop is going too far. He even says this whole legal fight could backfire on them.
He does, and it's a good point. If Games Workshop goes after everyone who uses Space Marine and they keep losing, it could set a precedent that weakens their control over the term. Imagine a situation where anyone can use Space Marine as long as their characters are different enough from the Warhammer ones.
That would definitely be a big change for sci-fi.
Right.
It makes you think about the balance between protecting intellectual property and encouraging creativity.
Absolutely. It's a complicated issue with good arguments on both sides. I think the important thing is to pay attention to this case. It could have a major impact on intellectual property law and on creative industries in general.
Yeah, the good advice.
Yeah.
This has been a really interesting deep dive into trademarks and intellectual property. We've looked at the legal arguments and explored how this could affect creativity. Hopefully it's given everyone some things to think about. Now it's your turn to weigh in. Do you think Games Workshop is right to protect their trademark, even if it means going after smaller creators? Or do you think Space Marine is such a common term that anyone should be able to use it? Let us know what you think. This is a conversation that's going to continue for a while. That's all the time we have for today. We'll be back soon with another deep dive. Until then, stay curious.